Hello and welcome to the museum for tonight's talk, Agent Sonya. I'm standing in Spy, Oxfordshire, our temporary exhibition which ends the end of April 24th. So if you haven't been here yet, please do try and come in and look at this fantastic exhibition. Most of the exhibits will be going back to the US at the end of the month, but we are hoping to refresh our Secret War display as well. Tonight's talk with Anthony Glees and Patrick Marnham is a particular favourite for the museum because obviously it extends all of our stories about Spy Oxfordshire. We're very grateful to Owen Montford for supporting tonight's talk, and I'm now going to hand you over to David Innes, one of our trustees, who will introduce the speakers. Please don't forget, sign up on the newsletter, and it would be fantastic if you could make donations to the museum. As I always say, it's only with your donations that we're able to continue with these lovely online talks, but also to put these kind of exhibitions together. Good night.
Hello, and welcome to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. This evening, we shall try to shed some additional light on the fascinating story of the World War II and Cold War activities in Oxfordshire of the Soviet female spy Ursula Kuczynski, the Agent Sonya of our title. Her story has recently been told by Ben McIntyre in his book of the same name. I found it a remarkable tale and commend it if you are interested in the way Soviet agents were identified and trained between the wars. Her espionage activities in China and Manchuria in the 1930s are extraordinary. Tonight we are very pleased to welcome Professor Anthony Glees, Professor of Politics at the University of Buckingham and Emeritus Director of its Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies, who examines Agent Sonya's activities in Oxfordshire between 1941 and 1950, and actually takes her story rather further than Ben McIntyre, and indeed challenges some of his conclusions. Partway through, you will see that Anthony Glees submits himself to questioning of his Agent Sonya assertions by Patrick Marnham, journalist, author and biographer, and who is a close observer of the activities of the intelligence community. It is splendid for us at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum that Anthony and Patrick have agreed to deliver their online talk together. We are most grateful to them both. I'm sure you will find their discussion interesting, especially if you are an Oxfordshire resident. You may come to look at your home area in a slightly different light after tonight. Please be sure to stay with us for the live question and answer session after the talk.
Well, good evening. I'm Anthony Glees. I'm a Professor Emeritus from the University of Buckingham, where when I was teaching, I was also Director of the Centre for Security and Intelligence Studies. I'm delighted to be speaking to you this evening from the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum in Woodstock. And I emphasise Woodstock because quite a bit of what I'm going to talk to you about in the minutes to come revolves around Woodstock, Oxford, 8 miles down the road, Glympton, a couple of miles up the road, Kidlington, a couple of miles to the west of us here. So this is a story that has really two aspects to it. a big, very big issue, an issue about the state of British intelligence and security from 1945 right up to the turn of the 20th century. It's a story which reveals the extent to which British intelligence was thrown into disarray by the allegations that within its ranks, the most secret parts of the British state were riddled with secret communists and had been riddled with secret communists ever since the 1930s, culminating in the 1960s and 1970s when this allegation was investigated against two of the most important people in MI5, the Deputy Director General, a man called Graham Mitchell, and Sir Roger Hollis, who was the Director General of MI5. These allegations were peddled by a group of MI5 and MI6 officers, led ultimately by Peter Wright, who wrote a book about it called Spycatcher. But others were complicit. Two names in particular in this regard, that of a man in MI5 called Arthur Martin and a man in MI6, officers, called Stephen de Mowbray. So these were very, very serious allegations. It suggested basically that MI5 had been as much on the Soviet side as it had been on the Western side and caused the deepest possible embarrassment to our government here in the United Kingdom because, critically, it undermined the relationship of trust between our biggest security and intelligence partner, the United States of America, and our own intelligence community, consisting of MI5, who do domestic security, MI6 or SIS, whose job it is to recruit agents from abroad who feed into the policy-making process, spies, if you will, and then what is today called GCHQ, the listening post that eavesdrops on the world's communications in order to keep us safe. So a very, very big thing. And then the second part of the story is a very detailed story about a curious woman who had a number of names. I'm going to refer to her as Sonya. Sonya was the code name given to her by Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, although she also seems to have had some connection with the other arm of Soviet intelligence, the NKVD, or as we would call it today, the KGB, or was the KGB under Soviet rule. The story of Sonya is also the story of these places here in Woodstock, Oxford, Glympton, and Kidlington. And what I want to do is not explore the rights and wrongs of the huge mole hunt in Whitehall, led by Peter Wright and the others, into Roger Hollis. In my opinion, and I said so 35 years ago, it was a complete nonsense, inspired by a defector called Anatoly Golitsyn, who could have been a purveyor of fake news, could just have been mad. We simply don't know. I'm not going to go into that. Been gone over many time and oft. Rather show how the story of Sonya reveals the extent to which this mole hunt was a total distraction of such proportions that it may almost certainly have been part of a Soviet intelligence deception plan in which Sonya was used. You have to know about Sonya. This is the book that she wrote in Germany called Sonya's Report, and published in the 1970s. Almost every East German school child had a copy of this book in which she outlined the time she spent from early 1941 to 1950 in the Oxford, Woodstock, Glympton area. And it formed the basis of a recent study by Ben McIntyre on Sonya, which basically looks at it most uncritically. Now, what I'm going to say is that about 10 years ago, our National Archives, they're called the National Archives rather than the National Archive, in Kew, used to be called the Public Record Office, released a file known as KV 641. The KV tells scholars that it is a file from the security service, from MI5. The 641 tells you the month and the year that the file was opened. And this is a file about Sonya. The very fact that MI5 had a file on Sonya, dated June 1941, although there's stuff in there from a few months before June, straight away raises important questions, because one of the major claims made by Peter Wright, Stephen de Mowbray and Arthur Martin, and supported by Anatoly Golitsyn, who came to London in order to reinforce their story, was that ultimately the Director General of MI5, Roger Hollis, was a communist mole because he failed to identify the presence in Oxford, Glympton, Kidlington, and Great Rollright, further down the road towards Stratford, of a major Soviet spy and wireless operator, Sonya, under the very noses of MI5, whose offices were in Keble College in Oxford and whose registry was less than half a mile away from where I'm speaking to you this evening, in Blenheim Palace, safe from the German bombers over London. So this was a huge charge they made, and on the face of it, it was a devastating charge. Of all the things that Sonya had done, the most important thing was the conveying in 1943, 42 to 43, the nuclear atomic secret being developed under the code name of two alloys, and then the Manhattan Project, which allowed the United States of America and the United Kingdom to construct the first atomic bombs. And as everybody knows, they were exploded in August 1945 over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within hours ended the Second World War in the Far East. So a major thing, a major secret. We didn't trust the Soviets, even though they were our allies. They weren't meant to have this secret. All we know is in 1945, the Potsdam meeting between Churchill and then Attlee and Truman, as he then became president, had become president, and Stalin, had a curious incident where a few hours before the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Stalin was taken to one side and told the West had a new and powerful weapon that would end the war in a matter of days. And it was noted that Stalin did not look surprised. He just said, oh, and that was it. Of course, today we know why he wasn't surprised, because he was told, and in 5 years, by 1949, the Soviet Union had developed its own atomic weapons, and the balance of power in the world changed dramatically. So that's the big story. Now, how does Sonya fit into this? How does file KV 641, what does it tell you? Well, it tells us, first of all, exactly how Sonya came to the United Kingdom. She came by boat and landed in Liverpool on the 8th of February 1941. Consider that date, the 8th of February 1941. A woman who came from a gifted, secular Jewish German academic family. She'd been a communist. She'd had various names. Her birth name was Ursula Kuczynski, but she was also known as Ruth Werner and had many other names in her intelligence career. She had come from occupied Europe and landed in Liverpool with a British passport, if you please. Within a few days, she was housed at 78 Woodstock Road in Oxford, one of the two major roads leading to the centre of Oxford. She then moved further north in North Oxford to 97 Kingston Road in Oxford. In March 1941, she moved to Avenue Cottage. The address at the time was 50 George Street, Summertown, Oxford. People who know Oxford well will say, oh, George Street wasn't in Summertown. It was during the Second World War. They changed the name. And you can still see the house that Sonya, the small house that Sonya lived in Summertown, and the much bigger house to which it was attached. A house owned by the brother of a leading Labour politician called called Lasky. The house belonged to Neville Lasky. Harold Lasky, his brother, was a major Labour figure. Neville Lasky was in Oxford because he was one of the lawyers used by MI5 in Oxford at Keble College. So the link between Sonya and MI5 was not just a geographical link, it was also, in a sense, a personal link, which she was in Oxford. She moved later on in the same month, in 1941, to the rectory at Glympton, down the road. In October 1942, she moved to 134 Oxford Road, Kidlington, to a property that she and her husband, to whom I'll come back in a second, rented for almost the whole of the Second World War. We think right up to the time she left for East Germany, for a reason that I'll explain. And then in 1945, she moved to the Firs at Great Rollright, as I say, on the road to Stratford-on-Avon, of significance because it is one of the highest pieces of ground between Oxford and Stratford. And if you're sending radio messages to Moscow, 2,000 miles away, the higher your aerial is, the greater your luck. So, on the face of it, if you're making the case for the prosecution, here is a woman, Soviet wireless operator, went on to get the Order of the Red Banner twice, a dyed-in-the-wool communist in the United Kingdom at a time when most people like her would have been interned as enemy aliens, yet she crops up with a British passport, for goodness sake, and moves around at will under the very noses of MI5. Now, you don't have to be paranoid, as people say Peter Wright was, or Glees was. There is something extremely odd here. And mostly, the story couldn't be understood. People like me who knew about Hollis privately, letters he'd written and to his family and so on, never believed for 1 second that he was a communist mole. In fact, he was the last person you would suspect of being a communist mole, and that people say, that proves he was one because he's the last person that you would expect to have been a communist. What scant documentary evidence there was about MI5's activities at the time during the Second World War showed, bizarrely, that Roger Hollis was one of the few people to have been alert to people like Sonya, communists in Britain during the Second World War. But there was no explanation of what else was going on. And then file KV 641 was released. And as I say, the first point about it is that that file, which has Sonya's name on the front as Ursula Kuczynski, and her husband's name, Len Beurton, it's spelt in a slightly odd way because it was French derived. It's Beurton. We always call Len Beurton. That file shows that they were known about. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a file. So, what did that mean? The answer it emerges only on close textual analysis. But I just want to take you to one letter that, in my opinion, is really the key and allows the full explanation to be given. Now, what we know is that in order to get her passport to come to the UK, Sonya had to marry a British passport holder, which would by right give her a British passport. Sonya married Len Beurton, divorced her husband, a Mr. Hamburger, divorced her husband, and the next month, in Geneva, in Switzerland, married Len Beurton. Len Beurton was known to be a communist, had been in the RAF during the Second World War, had fought very bravely on the left Republican side during the Spanish Civil War. That's all we knew about it. Len Beurton's marriage to Sonya appeared to be evidence again of the communist left-wing nature of the woman and of the relationship. Gave her that passport that enabled her to come to the Oxford area. On the 9th of March 1943, remember, by this stage, Hitler's armies had already attacked the Soviet Union, but they looked as if they were unlikely to destroy it. So it was a kind of turning point in the war, March 1943. And a letter is intercepted by the postal censors in Oxford that has been sent to Len Beurton at 134 Oxford Road, Kidlington. And it comes from Geneva. And it has been opened by the censor in Oxford, but it was also opened by various German censors as it made the trip from Geneva to the UK. You can see the swastika of the German censor on it. And this is what the letter says. It says, "My dear Beurton, I have heard nothing from you since your arrival in the United Kingdom. I hope this only means that you have little time for private correspondence. Communication with the UK has steadily deteriorated since your departure, and I have no doubt that the day is not far off when only the air will be available. Let us hear from you sometime. Yours, Victor Farrell." What's that letter about? Comes from Geneva. Who is Victor Farrell? Victor Farrell is head of the MI6 station in Switzerland, a highly gifted secret intelligence officer who is in close contact with a number of people he believes can help the United Kingdom in the secret fight against Hitler. He's also in touch with at least one of the dissident German generals who tried to blow Hitler up in July 1944. Key man, Victor Farrell, but not known to the general public, and fascinating. Now, what's he saying in that letter? "My dear Beurton, let us hear from you sometime. Let us hear from you sometime." You delve further into the archive, you then understand that Len Beurton, despite being a communist, despite having fought in the Civil War, was himself an agent of MI6. You then understand that when Sonya turns up saying she wants to go to the United Kingdom, not only does Victor Farrell know exactly who Sonya is, but when she says, "I need a British passport," he says, "I've got just the man for you, Len Beurton. Len will marry you." And within a matter of weeks, Ursula became Mrs. Beurton. But what the letter also shows is that there was an MI6 relationship, not just with Len Beurton, but with Sonya. Sonya was the reason that Len Beurton was in Kidlington. So what was really going on here? we know that Sonya, in her book, goes on and on about the fact that she was busy sending wireless messages from Summertown in particular, from a house that belonged to a lawyer who was working for MI5 at Keble College in Oxford, Neville Lasky QC. You couldn't make it up, really. But the point is, she did make it up. Neighbours in Summertown said, there's this odd German woman, and she's got a massive aerial in her house, all over the place. And the Chief Constable of Oxford, Mr. Fox, asked one of his officers to go and have a look at the house. And he came back and said, yeah, there's a radio transmitter there. And Fox said, well, what's going on? He said, well, it's a very odd thing, because it's not sending any messages. There's no evidence that any wireless messages from the Oxford area have been transmitted to anywhere. And you need to know there are about 1,000 so-called watchers in the Oxford area, paid for by, not much, by the Radio Security Service, radio hams, listening in for wireless messages which could not be explained. Why were they doing it? Because they were looking for German spies. You couldn't tell from a radio message in so many words, you couldn't tell whether the radio message was a message from a German Nazi spy in Britain going to the Third Reich, to Hamburg, or whether it was from a communist agent in Britain going to the Soviet Union. The radio message. The 1,000 watchers in Oxfordshire detected no signals at all from any address in Oxford. And when Special Branch Detective Inspector Rolfe went to have a look at it, Sonya showed him the area. She showed it all. Was never any sign. In none of the addresses that Sonya went to was there any evidence that radio messages had been sent. Even in Great Rollright, high on the hill, an obvious place, MI5 went to speak to Sonya, saw the aerial, but there was no evidence at all that any wireless... Indeed, in Great Rollright, it appears there was no mains electricity at that time. And to have powered a radio with a battery to get those 2,000 miles to the Soviet Union was at that time virtually impossible. So, what do we assume? First of all, it's clear that MI5 knew about her, and in file KV641, there are many MI5 reports about Sonya, some by Roger Hollis, and all of them say the same thing. We know exactly who she is, but she's not doing anything. There is no grounds to pick her up, no grounds to arrest her. No radio signals, nothing coming from her. Yet, the reason she was in Oxford was because she was given a British passport by MI6. So she was there for a purpose. What could the purpose have been? The files don't say it, but I think it is fair to assume she was given that passport because it was hoped that she would be turned into a double agent for the British. They knew she was a communist wireless operator with extensive experience. She'd been in China for years, worked together with Richard Zorger, the master spy, the German master spy who'd worked for Stalin. So they knew she was a radio operator. They knew that one of MI5's biggest successes during the Second World War was identifying German wireless operators in the UK and turning them into double agents, the so-called double-cross system. And I suspect the deal that was done with Sonya was this. Look, Sonya, you're a communist. You're of the Jewish persuasion. We can hand you over via Switzerland to the Germans any day of the week, or we'll get your British passport, you go to Britain, and then you tell us if there are any communist spies sending radio transmissions. And I believe that Sonya said, fine, that's exactly what I'll do. Send me to Britain, and I will inform you. And initially, the aim was to activate Sonya as a double agent, working for the British, telling us how Soviet things worked. So, to sum up this story, Sonya deceived MI6, deceived MI5 in the sense that she hid her activities, but she clearly sent wireless messages, certainly on Klaus Fuchs and for a period. So how did she do that? Well, there the answer is what went on at 134 Oxford Road, Kidlington, a little bungalow literally down the road from me. You can see it when you go into Oxford. It was a stone's throw from the RAF airport at Kidlington, and it was well known by Soviet wireless operators that one of the few places you could not intercept wireless messages was in the vicinity of a busy airport, because there was so much radio traffic you couldn't tell if there was anything going on. Sonya and Len never lived in Kidlington. They just rented the place with Soviet money. And I double bet you that that was the location of the radio set that Sonya used, whether it went to Russia or, more likely in my view, just to the Soviet embassy in Kensington, which was much closer, required less power. I do not know. Sonya was a master spy, no doubt about it. A lot of what she says in her book is nonsense and designed to implicate him at MI5 and show they were idiotic. It must be very painful for Hollis. He knew all about her, but he couldn't fix anything on her. And he couldn't fix anything on her because there was no evidence to fix anything. But her heart was as red as could be, and when it finally became clear through Fuchs's trial that Sonya had been the conduit and people came to arrest her, she scarpered to East Germany. Was that as straightforward as we might? Well, you know, I'm a slightly cynical man, I'm afraid. A few days before she's due to be arrested by Special Branch on the orders of MI5, she disappears to East Germany. Did MI6 want her out of the way? I should think they probably did.
Well, Anthony, that was really fascinating. I thought I knew quite a lot about Sonya, but you've just told me a whole lot more. I have some interest in it myself because way back when Chapman Pincher and co were trying to finger Roger Hollis, I worked at Private Eye, and we received several of those anonymous packages, which we now know were from Peter Wright, but at the time were clearly from someone involved in British intelligence. And we took it very seriously, of course. Private Eye didn't often get great big fat envelopes from MI5. And so we were well on the way to being duped as well. Subsequently, I recently read a book called War in the Shadows, which is about a different aspect of the intelligence war in the Second World War. And in that book, I found this character who I hadn't seen mentioned anywhere else, called Victor Farrell. So luckily, in the paperback edition, I've been able to mention some of your work, which I was unaware of originally. But I wasn't aware that I was very, very pleased to see that Victor Farrell did indeed exist. He was indeed in touch with London throughout the war, and he was a significant MI6 operator. Thinking of the letter which you've now described, there's one question which occurred to me. He's writing to Len Beurton, who has left Geneva, and he's asking, and he's lost touch with him. What did he expect Len to be doing in England? Do we know anything about that?
Well, the truth is that we don't, except by implication from the file 641. It appears that they hoped that Len would resume. He'd been in the RAF, but he had been an engineer, and that he would find a job somewhere in engineering and carry on spying, because, of course, British authorities were afraid of sabotage, and they were alert to this very kind of difficult issue that although the Soviet Union had become an enormously important ally after the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, nevertheless, in MI5, they did not believe that the aims and intentions of the Soviet Union ran parallel to those of the United Kingdom. So when I said in my presentation that of all the people you could suggest was a Soviet mole, Roger Hollis was the least likely, that was because in his more lowly position as the person in MI5 who was in charge of counter-espionage coming from communist quarters, Roger Hollis was continually warning everybody to watch the Reds.
Yeah.
And the only person in MI5 during the Second World War who was not taken in by Sir Anthony Blunt, surveyor of the Queen's pictures, the King's pictures, and a man of dazzling intellect and skills, who was greatly loved by everybody, from the Queen Mother down to ordinary officers in MI5. There was one person who said, "I don't trust the bugger," and that was Roger Hollis. So you would have thought if Hollis had been a mole, he would have gone along with everybody. Yet his track record was, we've got to watch these people.
Yes.
So I think that was the deal. But I don't think that Hollis liked it. You can MI6, Victor Farrell, tell Hollis and a man called Shillito, who was actually dealing with Sonya, it wasn't Hollis personally, he just saw the paper, to keep their grubby fingers off Sonya.
Yeah.
And even when the Americans wanted to do it, because an FBI officer in London called Mr. Simperman wanted to interview Sonya at the time of the Fuchs disclosures, they were told they couldn't see her.
Right.
She was our asset. They couldn't.
Right. So KV 641 clears Hollis. That it seems to me is established now. Presumably, it wasn't available to Chapman Pincher when the force.
Excuse me, that is such a good question, because when you look at the file, you can see on the front of the file how often it was taken out. Yes. And it was frequently taken out in the 1980s and 1990s, but as far as we could tell, it was not taken out in the 1960s and 70s at the time of the Great Mole Hunt.
No. I see. So Beurton, who has been sent over as the husband of a known GRU agent, seems to be in some confusion himself as to whether he's working for MI6 or the GRU. Is that correct?
It is correct. And I think the problem is that everything changes. And this is, again, where the detail story gets caught up in the really big high policy shift. So when Hitler invades the Soviet Union on the night of 21st, 22nd June, and the German armies go like a hot knife through butter into the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union becomes our ally. Within a few days, Churchill or Eden, I think it was Churchill, ordered government code and cipher school to stop trying to intercept Soviet codes. One thing perhaps I should have explained, it's a bit complicated, is although we were able to break some, but not all, of the German wireless codes through the Enigma machine and the ultra secret that was the intelligence generated, we could never really do it with the Soviets. And that was the importance of Sonya, because she was an operator. She knew what the codes were. And I think they thought, at that time, remember, from 1939, August 1939, to the 22nd of June 1941, the Soviet Union was Hitler's ally, not our ally. And she was working for Hitler's friend and ally. So the advantage of having somebody that could tell us a bit more about communist spies, they were called the Red Orchestra, for example, which continued after the war was over to be a major interest for Western intelligence. All the communist agents throughout Europe who had worked against the fascists, that Sonya had absolutely crucial things to tell us. So she came to Britain, but then in June 1941, all of a sudden, the Soviet Union became our ally.
Yes.
Churchill ordered all spying on Russia to stop. I know it sounds odd, but that was the order. And, I've had that told me by many people. There were one or two people that continued to try and break Russian codes, but they never did. Never, ever. All these clues came from something called Venona,
Yes.
well after the war. These wartime messages were never broken at the time because Churchill said, literally, Stalin wouldn't like it.
Well, he wouldn't, of course. And it wasn't that odd in a way, because we know that both Churchill and Stalin were terrified that the other one might come to a second
Absolutely.
peace with Germany.
Absolutely.
So presumably Churchill's order was to eliminate or diminish Stalin's fears.
Absolutely. So I think that high policy, a fundamental tectonic shift, a bit like Brexit, everything has to change.
Yeah.
Everything changed there. And Sonya suddenly had nothing to do. They didn't know what to do with her.
So is there any evidence that she ever sent anything back, real or false information, to Geneva or to her MI6 contact, whoever it was, that she ever fulfilled any part of her contract?
It's a great question. The answer is we simply don't know. It wouldn't be in this file. It would be in the files of GCHQ, and of course they are locked forever. But I doubt it. I don't think she actually did that much. I think she blew up her story in her book. She was a very useful propaganda tool for the communists, vital propaganda tool in many ways, and as hard as nails. Her own family had members carted off by Stalin and killed in the gulags. She never once questioned what she was doing. So I think she was an asset that could never really be realised because this great shift.
By MI6?
Yes, by MI6. It was a great idea.
Yes.
Imaginative, innovative.
And went seriously wrong.
Went seriously wrong.
The reason it went seriously wrong is that she and Fuchs then started working together.
Yeah.
How was that contact initiated? Who sparked that off?
Well, there are various stories. At the time, a man called Simon Kramer, who was a Russian intelligence officer in the Soviet embassy in Kensington, was withdrawn from the United Kingdom at the beginning of for reasons that aren't entirely clear. And the theory is that it could have been a member of Sonya's family who were refugees in London, and had a sister who lived in Oxford as well, that somehow Moscow Centre got a message to a member of the family saying, you ought to go and meet Klaus Fuchs. So Fuchs was in Birmingham, and in her book, Sonya describes, she says she rode her bicycle to Banbury, and they had a dead letter drop there and so on. I think that is most unlikely myself. I mean, she was obviously an energetic woman, but Banbury is, 35 miles away, uphill and down Dale. I don't think you would have cycled there. My colleague Tony Percy, and I should have explained in my presentation, that the archival research on which my story is based is his archival research, and his website, Cold Spur, is well worth seeing. But he tends to be a trees person rather than a woods person, whereas I tend to be a woods person rather than a trees person. So together we're quite good. Tony feels that they will have met at Snow Hill Railway Station in Birmingham over a cup of coffee, and bits and pieces were handed over there. I think that is it's highly plausible. But they might also have met walking around Blenheim Park.
Yes. Yes, they could indeed have done so. They could have done both.
They could have done both.
But So then we have this situation where MI5 are very suspicious. Well, they have certain suspicions. Hollis certainly seems to be suspicious. But he's blocked. He's not a very senior officer at that stage. He's a middle-ranking officer, I think. So he's then blocked, presumably by his own superiors in MI5. Is that how the block would have been imposed, do you think?
Well, I'm not sure how far he was blocked, because he went up to be, in 1956, Director General of MI5.
No, but I mean just simply in his suspicions about Sonya during the war.
The block came from MI6. They said, keep your grubby fingers off this woman.
Yes.
She's ours.
Right.
And that was... But he didn't even take no for an answer. I mean, he was an obstinate chap. Yeah. And Shillito, the officer in charge, repeatedly... I mean, Sonya's letters were intercepted, the mail was intercepted. They knew everything. I mean, and the censors in Oxford had its own MI5 station beyond what was going on in Keble College, called Box 500 Oxford. And all the communications going to Sonya were looked at, intercepted, a whole list of them, even a letter from her doctor in Kidlington to Sonya, which seems not to have been delivered. It's an odd thing, but you know, in real life these things are. But all the while, Sonya was being protected. Now, you might say to me, is there any evidence that actually Sonya remained an MI6 agent to the rest of her life?
Right.
It's not implausible. It's really not implausible.
Yes, well, that's taking it to another level. I'm just thinking, I'm returning to that idea about the block. People like Hollis, Shillito, and the Chief Constable were acting as they should have done, as members of the security service, essentially, for the security of the country. Yeah. And you're saying that at a higher level than that, MI6, with the collusion of very senior members of MI5, was actually interfering with the security of the country. Yeah. And this is an example of one of the security services totally undermining the other one.
Yes, it's a very key point, and thank you for making it strongly. But what it reveals, I think, is this very difficult world, particularly in respect of MI6, where in order to do their job, they have to work together with people who are basically on the other side. And they have to get close to them if they're to recruit them as agents. Yeah. And yet, if one of them, let's say, is a Kim Philby, then their position becomes one of huge power and influence. And I can't prove it, although Philby is in KV 641 and does an important thing, because MI5 says, we're having another look at Sonya. This hamburger she was married to, he's a really bad red agent. Can we find out if he's still in Geneva and he is in some way still in contact with Sonya? And Philby writes back and said, we've sent our guy to see, there's no trace of him, flat is empty, he's gone, so forget it. Now, that's just the sort of thing that Philby would have done, yes. Not actually pursued that lead at all, leaving Sonya in situ. So I do detect Philby's hand there. But, yes. Just imagine the moment when Peter Wright, Arthur Martin in this case, goes to see Roger Hollis and says, excuse me, Director General, I think we've identified the communist mole. And Hollis smiles and says, who is it? He says, you.
Yes. Well, now, this is another thing, moving on now to that point, after the war. One of the most delightful ideas you suggest is that this entire false phony news operation could have been a Soviet deception operation, could have been triggered possibly by Soviet intelligence.
Yes. I believe that to be the case.
The idea that Pritchard was working for Soviet intelligence is rather interesting.
Yes. Well, again, there are people who work without realising. He told me it was a story of a lifetime.
Yes, no, I mean the idea that he was falling into their trap. Yes.
But we see this with fake news, and this is actually an ongoing story of Russian, Soviet methods of subversion and deception that they are very, very skilled. It doesn't have to be Novichok in Salisbury. It can be working on people who are, they live in a wilderness of mirrors. They get paranoid, I don't know, but they're very, very suspicious. And working on this in the right way can have devastating results. We shouldn't forget, people died because of Sonya's treachery.
Yes, of course, of course. So do you think that the whole situation, that we might actually be a little safer if more of this information was published earlier and released earlier?
Well, just today, the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, Richard Moore, is writing and speaking about the need for MI6 to be more transparent and to be more open. And I published, like all academics, nobody ever reads what I wrote, but 5 years ago I published a chapter in a book published by an Oxford academic, under the heading of open secrecy. And I make the case that actually secrecy became totally counterproductive.
Yes.
Peter Wright had MI5 chasing its own tail for 20 years.
Yes.
Ruined people's lives, and this taint. And as I say, of all the people least likely to be a communist mole, Roger Hollis, of all people. And Gordievsky, whom I met a couple of times, he said, they laughed themselves silly.
Yeah.
In the Kremlin, when they heard the way the allegation against Hollis was playing out, they laughed so loud they made Red Square shake. It's a direct quote from him.
It's a wonderful talk. It's a wonderful talk, Anthony. A lot of new ideas there. Thank you very much.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in or use the guest chat link to ask a question.
Hello and good evening, and welcome to our live Q&A session after that talk. Thank you very much indeed to Anthony Glees and Patrick Marnham, who delivered that talk jointly. Most grateful to you both for that. And we'll now get into some questions, which I see are coming in, which is excellent. One point, though, is that Patrick Marnham, a author, biographer, and journalist, has quite a lot of published work behind him, as many of you will know by now. And if there's time and you want to ask questions about anything that he's published, written, maybe his War in the Shadows book, the recent book published in 2020 about Prosper, the SOE network, which was betrayed in France in 1943, then by all means put in a question and we'll see if we can include it. Can we get into questions, though, straight away? And I think the first one I should direct to you, Anthony, if I could, is about how are we so sure that she was a double agent? Sonya was a double agent.
Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you very much for your very kind invitation to speak at the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum. And you do a tremendous job. And I'm delighted to have been able to do a little bit to help your work. So how do we know? The answer is we can't be sure, I'm afraid. This is a wilderness of mirrors. But for me, it is the link between Victor Farrell, Len Burton, and Sonya, and the continual protection of Sonya whilst she is in Oxford, Woodstock, and Kidlington by MI6 that tells us there was a connection between Sonya and MI6, that it would be right for us to call Sonya an agent of MI6. And if you think of all the bits and pieces in KV 641 that describe the relationship between MI6 and Sonya and Len Burton, that only makes sense if they think that Sonya is working for her. And it's a reasonable assumption to make that MI6, and particularly Victor Farrell, who
as I say in my talk, we don't know very much about him. It's a great biography for somebody to write about him. He was an academic as well as an MI6 officer, and full of ideas. And he will have known about the double cross idea, that you take a spy from the other side and you turn them with a really big offer that they can't refuse. And in Sonya's case, it was life in Britain with members of her family, or being handed over to the Gestapo at the Swiss Third Reich border. I mean, that really was. She was given an offer she couldn't actually refuse, and it looked like, good sense. But the truth was that even if she had wanted to spy on Russia, as MI6 wanted, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union and Churchill's order that all intelligence work against the Soviet Union should cease meant she couldn't do anything even if she wanted to. So I think she was just, she was fallow. She was held like a field with clover to be ploughed one day.
And so the issue about why the Oxfordshire police didn't confiscate her radio, her transmitter, knowing that she was capable of, she had the interest to be a spy, an agent against this country, simply plays to that assertion, doesn't it?
Absolutely. She had done nothing wrong that they could discover. She had done absolutely nothing wrong. She hadn't even concealed. That's the clever thing. She was almost like a conjurer. She showed them the wrong pack of cards. And
you want to come in on this? Patrick, do you want to come in on this? Can you hear that?
Yes, I can hear. Yes. Yes, I mean, but that is one of the strangest things about it, that they should have set up this brilliant idea and then been unable to use that. I wonder, though, to what extent Churchill's order that all intelligence activities against the Soviet Union should cease was obeyed. Do we know anything about that?
Well, yes, we do. I mean, my colleague at the University of Warwick, Professor Richard Aldrich, has written, I think it's called The Secret History or The Hidden History of GCHQ. And he says that there were a couple of code breakers at Bletchley Park, of course, the forerunner of GCHQ, who did not obey Churchill's order to stop trying to break Soviet codes. And they continued to fiddle around with them. But that's, Richard Aldrich did not work from the archives of GCHQ because they weren't available to work from. It's not a criticism. He did the very best job he could, but there was virtually no material. None of this is mentioned in the official history of GCHQ, which was published really recently, a job given to a Canadian historian of signals intelligence, not to any Brit. And when I asked him about Venona and all of this stuff, he said, it hadn't seen any of it, didn't know anything about it. So I think it is possible that people were fiddling around trying to break Soviet codes. But to the best of my knowledge, for the entire period of the existence of the Soviet Union, we broke virtually no Soviet wireless code. They were very, very good at keeping their secrets. So I think that, yes, Churchill's order was obeyed, but even if it hadn't been obeyed, I doubt if much would have come. But it was the politics of it. Churchill knew that Stalin was a kind of spy master in chief. He was deeply suspicious, and that the best thing to do was simply not to poke a stick in the side of the bear, because he might snap back and do a deal with Hitler. After all, he had done a deal with Hitler in 1939.
Following up on that, Henry Spielberg's come in with a question about what other sources there may be about Sonya's activities, apart from the GCHQ files, which you say are closed forever. Are there any other archives which we might turn up one day to provide further information about this girl?
Well, that's a brilliant question. And I suppose in the early 1990s, excuse me, when Yeltsin took over and communism collapsed, there were a lot of hopes that the archives in Russia would actually give us a lot of the things that we didn't know about from our own archives. And indeed, there were a lot of Russians publishing stuff and asking for a lot of money from people, including impecunious British academics, which they claimed would, excuse me, reveal the Russian side of the secret. It never happened. There was no stuff worth having from any of it. And I think there is probably a deeper reason for that, which we know now. I mean, I've always been, I'm afraid, suspicious of Russia. A short window after the collapse of communism when it might have gone in another direction, perhaps. The fact is that the KGB never collapsed. The KGB remained where it is right now, different name, but basically doing the same things. It's not coincidental that Vladimir Putin, their man in Dresden, best, wonderful job, KGB, highly sought after. As a very young man, he was identified as being exceptional. It's not coincidental that he is now the president of Russia and causing us all this awful, awful trouble. And I think the idea that the KGB would ever agree to releasing any of its secrets, because a really good secret can be used time and time again.
Absolutely. A question here from Peter Manley. Thank you very much, Peter. Does open secrecy, he says, not make for less or no delineation between intelligence and fake news, increasing state and public fear?
Well, that's, of course, not just a brilliant question, but it's even more brilliant a question today than it was a few weeks ago before Putin's murderous attack on Ukraine, and people were just beginning to understand about fake news. So I think our Secret Intelligence Service has actually taken a substantial step towards open secrecy. They can't describe operations, but particularly over the Ukraine war, they have come out into the open. I mean, it's almost in between the Kabul fiasco and the flight from Afghanistan and the attack on Ukraine. There's been a kind of change, I think, in the attitude of the Secret Intelligence Service, both by the current C, the head of MI6, Richard Moore, but also by his predecessor, Sir Alex Younger, who is frequently heard on the radio, frequently interpreting, frequently giving us what MI6 considered to be their real view on Putin. I think that is extremely important. So what I mean by open secrecy, and we've been able to trust UK intelligence and American intelligence in a way in which, dare I say it, we trusted particularly UK intelligence in 2002, 2003 over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, only to discover that they were really making a mountain out of a molehill, and that intelligence was fake. But this is a really, really important issue, I think, and that our spooks are slightly coming out of the shadow. I mean, think of Christopher Steele, for example, former MI6 officer, #1 Russia expert, has been playing a part in enabling public understanding of what Putin is actually now doing. That's a great thing. We pay these people a lot of money. They're very fine, brave people, and they are far less comic, if you like. Now they are less in the shadows and more in the public eye. But I don't know if Patrick Marnham is really the expert on this, not me.
Well, I wouldn't say I was an expert on it, but it does alarm me slightly. If you don't have open secrecy, as it's now called, if there isn't some possibility at some point of examining what was done and what happened, how do you know that you can trust the people who are operating under deep cover all the time? There has to be some kind of accountability, some kind of supervision or regard on these operations. Of course, we all understand why agents risking their lives in live operations should be protected and will be protected for many years. But I think at some point, there has to be a kind of a rule, or anyway, an assumption, that these operations can be examined by historians. I can quite see why intelligence officers wouldn't agree with that, but historians also have to examine the greater public good, surely. And at some point, the historian must be allowed in. I mean, no doubt many of the tricks carried out by Sir Francis Walsingham in the 16th century would still be useful today if they could be kept secret. And they may well be kept secret under the present arrangements. Doesn't mean to say we shouldn't now know, well, in fact, everything about what was going on then.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter. I hope you feel that's a full answer to your question. Philip has asked a question, back to Sonya, really, about how and when did the Soviet Union reactivate Sonya's career as a Soviet spy? This really, I think it relates to her work from London or from Oxfordshire after she got here. And I don't know whether you've got any views on that. I know that Ben McIntyre covers it quite fully in his book.
Well, you often say that, one often says dog doesn't eat dog. But I think that Patrick makes a very important point when he says historians, and I wouldn't call myself an historian, but an historical investigation into the secret world is very, very necessary. And I think it is also important that journalists do their job, and Ben McIntyre writes like an angel. However, his story is almost totally derived from what Sonya said about herself and her own self-glorification in order to show MI5 in a bad light, not MI6, MI5, when, as I've argued, it's really the other way around. MI5 come out of this as well as they possibly can. And it's MI6 who have to take risks. I mean, that is the point, as Patrick so rightly says in his own work on the French resistance during the Second World War. It makes the same kind of point. You have to work with the people who are there, who are willing to risk life and limb to support your cause, you think. And sometimes, though, you're going to find you're working with wrong-uns and people who are doing it for their own purposes. And that the Russians were particularly good at manipulating a situation to their own advantage. So perfectly ready to sacrifice people in the French resistance, for example, but not just them, Dutch resistance, even the German resistance, which existed to Hitler, to sacrifice them in the same way that the Red Army was perfectly prepared to sacrifice the Polish Home Army in 1944, the time of the Second Warsaw Uprising in 1944, because Stalin would prefer to have Polish soldiers killed than to help them defeat the Germans and therefore assume a role in post-war Poland. So there's a deeply dangerous, horrible, murderous, cynical game being played by the Reds here. We tinkered with it a bit, and that's what John le Carré, I think, sensed, because he was very, very critical of all this stuff, because he thought we were, he described MI6 officers as people who clean the sewage at night so you don't have to smell it during the day, this kind of thing. So I would say that the true extent of what the Soviets did is unknown and will be unknown because these are state secrets. But if you were to ask me, was Fuchs the only person of interest to Sonya, I would say definitely no. And in Oxford, there were plenty of other people doing the same sort of work as Fuchs. And I bet you that Sonya arranged to go and see them and have tea with their wives and this kind of thing.
How very interesting. That does raise the question about her work with Fuchs. And were others involved? Is there evidence of that?
Well, my good friend and colleague Tony Percy would know that. One's got to be very, very careful about Fuchs was a traitor. He was identified as a traitor thanks to wireless messages, given the code name Venona, that were intercepted and decrypted only after the war. They were collected, but not decrypted until the war was over. But MI5 did not want to reveal in a public arena, in court, the fact that they were capable of decrypting the very specific messages. These weren't straightforward Soviet codes. They were particular codes from agents in North America, and they could be decrypted, unlike most Soviet wireless traffic. And MI5 wanted to keep this a secret, so they needed to have a confession from Fuchs, and they got that confession. Now, other people were named by Fuchs, and MI5 asked questions about other people, including some extremely well-known professors of physics at Oxford University. Rashly, one or two people 30, 40 years ago gave their names and found themselves in court paying out large sums in libel because there was never any hard proof. You can't just go and say this person is a spy. To call somebody a spy or a traitor, that's one of the worst things you can do. And if there's no hard evidence, MI5 is certainly never going to say, oh yes, there was this person. But you have to ask yourself, what are the chances that somebody like Sonya would have picked up other talent along with Fuchs? And I have to say, I think the chances are extremely strong.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a break for a second. And just to remind our audience, first of all, I hope you're enjoying the talk tonight and the questions. But please don't miss an opportunity this evening to donate to the museum, because this is so important for us. We don't get any public funding at all. And I hope you'll feel that as we've actually taken the trouble to come to you on your sofa, that your enjoyment should be twice as much as if you'd had to struggle into Woodstock to hear our talk in the museum. So please consider making a donation to the museum tonight. It means everything to us. Back to our questions. Peter Manley's come in with another one, which is really about KV 641. I don't know how much you knew, Peter, about KV 641 before it came up tonight, but he says that it names intelligence operatives. Does it refer to any oversight by politicians or state departments? Which is an interesting one.
Yeah. Well, that's a very quick answer to that, which is no, not at all. There is no direct politician or political leader involved.
No cabinet positions or anything like that.
No. And again, I think there's sort of as I understand it, the way MI5 saw itself, certainly during the war, was as a secret organization who had a duty to whisper in the ears of those with power if those with power wanted to hear from MI5, but if not, to get on with the job in hand. And that endured. I mean, Harold Macmillan, who of course was an important figure in his own way during the Second World War and then became Prime Minister, the Director General of MI5 has a right of access to the Prime Minister, and something that may prove to be relevant when people come to write the history of Boris Johnson's premiership. So they have the right to go and say, and they also, MI5 have a right to do their own stuff more than MI6 or GCHQ for obvious reasons, because we are a free liberal democracy and we don't want to have a secret police in this country. So they don't take orders from politicians, but they're meant to whisper in politicians' ears. But when Roger Hollis went to see Harold Macmillan, I can't quite remember whether it was to do with Blunt or somebody like that, said, "Prime Minister, I have to tell you that we have discovered a secret communist." Macmillan gave him an absolutely filthy look and said, "When my gamekeeper discovers a fox, I expect him to dispose of it without showing me the carcass." Now, kindly leave. So, politicians aren't really asked about. There is a link, of course, and again, this is a very difficult area. I made the point that Sonya in Summertown was lodging with Harold Lasky QC, an MI5 lawyer, we're told, and the brother of, with Neville Lasky QC, the brother of Harold Lasky, who was one of the most important Labour politicians at the time, certainly had the ear of Attlee. Now, you could feed that into a narrative and ask yourself, did MI5 not, worry about left-wing Labour politicians, and did they not think that there might be sort of communist connections or dangers? The answer is absolutely not. The people from Attlee down, Ernie Bevin, all these people, they might have been on the left, but they were absolutely and fundamentally anti-communist. They loathed the Soviet Union, and the real danger came actually not so much from the organized left and organized politicians. The real danger came particularly, I think, from academics, from, as it were, people like myself, who during the Second World War found their brains and skills being used by the British government to help defeat Hitler and indeed to have good relations with the Soviet Union. And they were the problematic people, the Anthony Blunts, very, very clever and sufficiently clever to work for the other side without MI5 knowing. And so no political interference, nothing in KV 641, even though there were policies. I mean, the story that this FBI agent in London, Mr. Simperman, had huge doubts about Sonya and Len Beurton and wanted to have the chance to, quote, interview them. MI6 said they can't have him. That would be unthinkable today. If somebody in the US Embassy in London said, "Oh, we'd like to have a word with this chap," MI5 would say, "Of course, at once." But not in the Second World War. It's very interesting.
Yeah, very good. Thank you very much. There you are, Peter. I hope that helps. Sonya wrote her memoirs or her story in the 1970s. Now, why? Why did she do it then? She left England in the 50s, early 50s, and then she reappears with this book in the 1970s. Why do you think, is that timing significant, do you think? That's another question that's come in.
I do think it's significant. I think Sonya was kind of reactivated. I mean, she was very elderly actually at this time. She was a granny, and yes, she was part of the ruling elite because of her wartime career, and the only woman, perhaps the only person, to have twice been given the Order of the Red Banner. So she was a prominent person in East Germany, but basically hidden. I think she was activated because somebody, probably in the KGB, could even have been Marcus Wolf, the head of the secret intelligence part of the Stasi, but also high in the KGB. You couldn't really get a cigarette paper between the East German intelligence service and the KGB at this time. May have seen an advantage in bringing Sonya's story out into the public because it added support to people like Peter Wright and Stephen de Mowbray and Arthur Martin, who were absolutely convinced the only way you could explain the Sonya story was by positing that Roger Hollis was a mole. So the Soviets, the KGB, they saw a fire and they thought of a way of pouring some petrol on it. And I think that was what Sonya's task was. And again, for those of us, who are interested in the ideas here, it is the Soviet, dare I say, the Russian way of subversion, of using fake news, because there are, I think, many things in Sonya's book that are absolute nonsense and fake, but can be presented in a very sinister way. And you have a prime journalist like Harry Chapman Pincher. I'm very friendly with Harry Chapman Pincher, very charming. He used to invite me 30 years ago to wonderful lunches at the Randolph Hotel in Oxford and spin these stories, none of which I believed. I thought they were all totally implausible. But what I didn't know when we were having consommé at the Randolph dining room was that Peter Wright was feeding Pincher questions and points to kind of put to me, and that all emerged in Peter Wright's diaries and papers. So Harry Chapman Pincher was fueling, in his own way, this fire on which Sonya's memoirs had thrown petrol. And again, John le Carré fanciers, in my view, perhaps le Carré's finest book, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. It's all about this kind of thing. I mean, Sonya herself doesn't figure, but she is exactly the sort of person that they're up against there. And Liz Gold's the sort of classic idiot communist who is used and manipulated and betrayed in the same way that Sonya will have betrayed people she knew in Oxford.
Patrick, did you have any consommé with this chap in the Randolph Hotel?
No, I wasn't nearly distinguished enough for that. But, unfortunately, sadly enough, on Private Eye, we always rather mocked Harry Chapman Pincher. I don't know why we did exactly. I think we had a sense that to select Roger Hollis as a KGB agent seemed completely ridiculous, even if one only knew his brother and his son, as I did. The idea that this man was anything but exactly what he appeared to be just seemed so peculiar. So sadly, no consommé, I'm afraid, for Private Eye reporters at that time.
One of the things that I noticed, which is a difference, I noticed this myself from the book which Ben McIntyre has written, and your story was about how she met Beurton. You imply that Beurton was delivered to her on a plate by MI6 in Geneva. The story that Ben McIntyre tells is that she and he were working pretty closely together as Soviet agents in Switzerland for some time before she made her break to England.
Yes, I do know that, but there's a really important fact about that I don't think Ben addresses properly, which is that Sonya was very happily married to Mr. Hamburger and had children with Mr. Hamburger, who are, still very, very, very proud of their mother, Sonya. There was absolutely no reason, marriages break down, people fall in love with other people, but there are always signs of that one way or another. But in the case of Sonya, it was like a light switch being turned on. They were put together, and she quite liked him. I mean, what we know about Sonya is she quite fancied Len. She was perfectly happy to be together with him, but it wasn't like that. She was married to the red flag of communism, and I think she did love Mr. Hamburger, but she needed desperately to get out of Switzerland. And I don't think we should forget that, the Gestapo did not like communists, of course not, but they hated Jews even more. And a Jewish communist was the worst thing. So had the Gestapo got their hands on her, she would have been horribly tortured before being murdered. And Sonya knew that, and there was no purpose to it. I think she was identifiable easily as a Jewish person. So to offer her this lifeline, which implied a marriage with Len, and she was curious, and she took the marriage to its logical legal point, and it was certainly a consummated relationship, and that was fine. And she was quite friendly with Mr. Hamburger afterwards. So I don't think it was a marriage of love. No, I think it was a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage of Secret Service convenience. These people are hard as nails, and that is the way they are. And I think on our side too, you know, people often say about Kim Philby, again, this woman, that woman, hard drinker, a lot of evidence. I mean, my distinguished former colleague, Hugh Trevor Roper, an Oxford professor, wrote years and years ago, 50 years ago, that he thought Philby was a deeply suspicious person, had contact with communists. But the answer always came back, that's his job. He works for MI6. He's their chief anti-Soviet person. Of course he has contact with communists. How do you imagine he does his job? So you can be as hard as nails. You can conceal yourself. And you know, that wonderful TV interview where Philby was asked whether he was the fifth man. And he said, no, not the fifth man, a complete nonsense. And he was lying through his teeth. Sonya had that quality, as hard as nails.
I think that's a good opportunity to close our discussion. Unless either of you want to say anything more about Agent Sonya. We've been going for half an hour and your dinners must be calling you, I should think. Thank you very much. Most grateful to you. I'm going to draw things to a close now and thank a number of people. First of all, can I very warmly thank Owen Mumford. Owen Mumford, a Woodstock firm close to our museum in Woodstock, and your support so close is very, very important to us, and we really appreciate that. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Clive Smith, who's our filmmaker, our editor, and really he works for Highly Borden Video, but he's done the lion's share of pulling all this together in technical terms. Most grateful, especially to all of you for your donations. Please don't forget us. And if you remember tomorrow that you haven't given us a donation tonight, then it'd be marvelous if you wouldn't mind doing that. To our speakers, Anthony Glees and Patrick Marnham, I really can't thank you enough on behalf of the soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum for doing a superb job. I would like to present to you from the museum this volume. A copy for each of you will be coming to you before long. This is Simon Harris's acclaimed history of the 52nd Light Infantry, the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire Buckinghamshire Light Infantry in the Great War. It's immensely readable. It's a very modern book. It's only 20 years old. And it's beautifully researched, beautifully illustrated, and I hope it will be of interest to you and those who look at your shelves in due course. It's quite a wait, I have to warn you. But thank you very much. Can I just mention to people, if you have an Oxfordshire county and conflict story, then tell us about it. I had no idea when we started out on this 18 months ago or so about Agent Sonya. I have to admit that, Anthony, to you. But I'm so grateful to you for coming forward and telling us the story and for bringing Patrick into it as well. It's made a tremendous difference tonight, but other people may have other stories which we'd love to hear. And we can tell a pretty wide range of stories with our conflict and county strapline. Let us look forward now to our next talk, which is just over 2 weeks from now, on the 14th of April. It's also on the eve of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp at the end of the Second World War. And we'll be welcoming then Dr. Mifamwe Lloyd, a long-time friend, I should say, of the museum, who will reveal to us a fascinating connection between a soldier from the Oxfordshire Yeomanry, one of the very first regiments into the liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and one of the survivors who were liberated. Of course, these men witnessed horrific scenes of disease and death, but they also show They also saw acts of great kindness, and they came across individuals who they remembered for the rest of their lives. One of these, Naomi Kaplan, always remembered Arthur Tyler from that regiment, with whom she struck up a relatively close relationship through correspondence and so on. It was Mafamwe who helped us to develop our Bergen-Belsen permanent display in the museum, which I think is an important one, because it really is soldiers of Oxfordshire at war. She returned to this specific piece of research during the 2020 lockdowns, and her story, she feels, shows the power of kindness as much as it shows the brutality and ghastliness of war. And the power of kindness, of course, is something we all need right now, all the time, don't we? So thank you again to our speakers. And until the 14th of April, when we'll be talking about Bergen-Belsen, good night.